18 cylinders, 2 rows of 9, stacked front to back, packed into a case barely wider than a garbage can lid. On the bench at Wright Field, Ohio, in the spring of 1945, that's what sat under the work lights, a Nakajima Homare engine, pulled from a wrecked Ki-84 Hayate fighter and shipped 4,000 miles for one reason: to find out how the Japanese had built a fighter that could outclimb a P-51 at low altitude, with an engine that, on paper, shouldn't have been able to breathe. The case was scorched on one side. 2 of the exhaust stacks were gone, sheared off in the crash that brought it down. But the block itself was intact, and intact Homar engines were rare. Most of the ones America had seen up to that point came in pieces, salvaged from wreckage on Pacific airstrips, too damaged to run. This one could be mounted on a test stand and started. Before they turned it over even once, the lead engineer on the report noted something that didn't make sense. The engine displaced 35.8 liters, nearly identical to the American Pratt & Whitney R2800 that powered the Corsair and the Thunderbolt. But it was 4.5 inches smaller in diameter. Same displacement, smaller frontal area, less drag, more power, less engine to hide it in. By the time they finished taking it apart, they'd found the reason. And it would change how the United States understood exactly what it was still fighting and exactly where to aim next. The teardown started the way every teardown at Wright Field started, with a tape measure, a notepad, and no assumptions. The Homar's rated output was 1,990 horsepower in its later variants. The R2800 needed a diameter of 52.8 inches to produce roughly the same number. The Homar did it in 46.5. Nakajima's engineers, under chief designer Tadashi Nakata, had chased one obsession above all others through the entire design: keep the frontal area small. A smaller diameter meant a smaller cowling. A smaller cowling meant less drag, and less drag meant a fighter that could outturn and outclimb anything built around a fatter American engine. One of the technicians on the report, a propulsion officer named Alan Reese, who'd spent 3 years pulling apart downed Axis engines on both fronts, sat back from the bench and said the number out loud twice, like he didn't trust it the first time. Then he wrote in the margin of his notes, "Same fire, smaller box." Because here's what that meant in plain terms: cramming the same combustion power into a smaller space doesn't just save drag, it concentrates heat. 18 cylinders, tightly packed, generating enormous energy, wrapped in a cowling with almost no room to spare. And radial engines cool themselves with nothing but air moving across metal fins. Somewhere in that tiny space, the Homar had to solve a cooling problem that American designers had simply avoided by building bigger. They took a break before going further. Reese made tea in the corner of the hangar, the way he did most afternoons, and let it go cold on the bench while he reread the captured Japanese maintenance placard that had come off the engine, translated overnight by an interpreter attached to the unit. That week, 6,000 miles away, Marine and Army units were fighting through the hills above Naha on Okinawa, taking losses from Japanese aircraft that, on paper, the Allies should have owned the sky against. Understanding why those aircraft kept performing above their apparent means wasn't academic. It was the difference between knowing what you were facing in the invasion of Japan itself, still being planned that spring, and guessing. This is the part of the story where I'd normally ask you to hit subscribe, and I will in a second. But I want to say why first. Stories like this one don't get told because the tank rolled further or the fighter flew faster. They get told because somebody in a cold hangar noticed a number that didn't add up and followed it. If that's the kind of history you want more of, real engineering, real documents, real names, the subscribe button is right there, and it costs you nothing but a second. Now, back to the bench. What they found stopped the room. The cooling fins on the Homar's cylinder heads were spaced at roughly 3 millimeters apart, nearly twice the fin density of anything in an American production radial engine of comparable size, and they weren't cast rough and machined flat, the way mass production fins usually were. They were machined to a contoured taper, each fin thinner at the tip than at the root, shaped to shed heat at a rate that varied deliberately across the surface of the cylinder. Rees called in 2 more engineers from the next hangar over. One of them, a machinist by trade before the war, ran his thumb along the fin edges and said it looked like it had been finished by hand, not stamped. He wrote that observation directly into the report. Hand-finished tolerances on a mass-production military engine. Something no American plant would have attempted at that fin density, because the labor cost alone would have been prohibitive. What it meant was simple, and it unsettled them. Nakajima hadn't solved the small diameter cooling problem by accepting worse cooling. They had solved it by machining cooling fins so precise, so exactly tuned to the airflow across that specific cylinder that a smaller engine could shed heat almost as efficiently as a larger one. It wasn't a compromise, it was surgery. The second discovery came from the back row of cylinders, the ones every radial engine designer dreads, because the front row blocks their airflow and they run hotter than anything else in the engine. On most twin-row radials, that's an accepted weakness. Engineers put deflector baffles around the rear cylinders, accept some performance loss, and move on. On the Homar, the rear row baffles were a separate, individually shaped sheet metal system, each panel curved to funnel air through specific gaps between the front row cylinders and onto specific hotspots on the rear row, cylinder by cylinder, not as a set. Rees laid the baffle pieces out on a canvas sheet on the floor, 18 of them, no 2 identical. He measured 4 at random. All 4 differed from each other by less than a millimeter of intended design curvature, meaning the differences weren't manufacturing error. They were engineered. Somebody at Nakajima had modeled the airflow around every single cylinder position in that engine and built a unique piece of metal to solve each one's specific heat problem. He wrote one line in the report that the unit's commanding officer would later underline in red: "This is not standard radial engine cooling. This is airflow surgery, cylinder by cylinder." That same week, over the home islands, B-29s were flying daylight raids against aircraft factories, and mission planners back at 20th Air Force headquarters were staring at target folders trying to decide which plants mattered most. The Homar engine on that bench was about to become part of that answer. They set the engine aside for a moment. Rees wanted a second opinion from the metallurgy section before going further. And while they waited, one of the younger engineers picked up a single loose cylinder fin that had cracked off during transport and turned it over in his hand for a long time without saying anything. What none of them had said out loud yet was the obvious question. If this cooling system was this precise, this deliberately engineered, why were captured pilot logs and maintenance reports from the Philippines full of complaints about Homar engines overheating, seizing, losing power in combat? The design on the bench looked close to flawless. The engines in the field were failing constantly. Something didn't match. The metallurgy section answered that question by cutting cross-sections from 3 different Homar engines, recovered from 3 different aircraft, built at 3 different points in the war, and comparing them under magnification. The earliest engine, built in 1943, showed the fin tolerances Rees had measured: tight, consistent, precisely tapered. The alloy in the cylinder heads was uniform, properly heat-treated, exactly what the design called for. The second engine, built in late 1944, showed fin spacing that drifted by as much as half a millimeter from the design spec. Small, but enough to disrupt the airflow calculations Nakajima's engineers had built the whole cooling system around. The alloy composition had changed too. Aluminum was in short supply in Japan by then, and the metallurgists found trace substitutions, lower-grade alloys stretched with whatever was available. The third engine, built in early 1945, was worse again. Fin edges were blunt where they should have been tapered. Baffle panels that should have been individually shaped were, on this engine, identical stampings. Someone at the factory had simplified the process to save time, at the cost of the precision the whole design depended on. Rees laid the three cross-sections side by side under the lamp and didn't write anything for almost a full minute. Then he wrote, "The design did not fail. The nation building it did." It's worth sitting with that for a second because it's easy to miss what it actually meant. The Homar wasn't a bad engine. On the bench, in its original 1943 form, it was arguably a better piece of engineering than anything comparable the Allies had built. Smaller, lighter, more power for its size, cooled with a precision that took skilled hands and careful inspection at every stage. But that precision was also its weakness. It only worked if every single engine coming off the line matched the tolerances of the prototype. And by 1944, Japan didn't have the skilled labor, the raw materials, or the manufacturing capacity left to hold that line. Every engine built after that point was a slightly worse copy of a design that had almost no margin for being worse. That's why Ki-84 pilots in the Philippines and over Okinawa were flying an airframe that could, on its best day, outturn a Mustang, and losing engines to overheating and seizure at a rate that had nothing to do with American guns. One more piece of the puzzle remained, and it's the one that mattered most to the men writing the report, because it wasn't really about the past. It was about what came next. Rees asked the intelligence liaison attached to the unit a direct question. Where was this level of precision manufacturing even possible in Japan anymore? The answer came back within a day. Homar production, especially the early high-tolerance engines, was concentrated overwhelmingly at one facility: the Nakajima aircraft engine plant at Musashino, on the western edge of Tokyo. Smaller subcontractors built components, but the final precision assembly, the hand-fitting that made the cooling system work as designed, happened almost entirely in that one complex. Rees underlined the name twice in his own notes. Here is what that meant. One factory, one address, everything that made the best fighter engine Japan had ever built, the engine giving the Ki-84 its edge in the air over Okinawa, came from a single production line north of Tokyo. Cripple that address, and you didn't just slow down engine output. You broke the one place in the country still capable of building an engine to the tolerances the design required. Every Homar after that would be a rougher, worse copy of an already fragile precision machine. The exact failure pattern the metallurgists had just found sitting on their own bench. The Musashino plant was already on 20th Air Force target lists that spring. What this engine did was change how it was prioritized. It wasn't just an aircraft factory anymore. It was the only place in the Japanese Empire that could still build a working example of its best engine. Bombing raids against Musashino, beginning in earnest in November 1944 and continuing through the spring of 1945, were no longer just about reducing aircraft numbers. They were about severing the one facility capable of precision the rest of Japan's wartime industry could no longer match, grounding the country's best fighters not by shooting them down, but by making sure they were never built correctly again. By the time American bombers had finished with Musashino, Homar production had collapsed to a fraction of its 1943 output, and what did survive assembly came off the line closer to the crude 1945 sample on Rees's bench than the precise 1943 original. Ki-84 squadrons that had once been feared for their climb rate were, by the summer of 1945, grounded as often by mechanical failure as by combat losses. The engine that should have kept giving Japan an edge in the air had been quietly disarmed. Not on the runway, but in a factory 200 miles from any airfield it ever flew from. That engine sits today in a museum collection in the United States, cylinder heads exposed under glass. The fin spacing that once stopped a room of engineers, now just a texture most visitors walk past without a second look. There's no placard explaining that the fins get thinner toward the tip, or that no two baffle panels on the original design were meant to be identical, or that a metallurgist once laid 3 cylinder heads under a lamp and watched a country's entire industrial decline written into half-millimeter increments of aluminum. Most people who stop in front of that case see an old radial engine, slightly scorched, 18 cylinders arranged in a shape they don't recognize. They don't see the fact underneath it that the most dangerous thing about that engine was never its power. It was how precisely it had to be built to have any power at all, and how completely a nation at war can lose the ability to build precisely one worn tool and one substituted alloy at a time, until the machine that once out-engineered everyone simply stops being able to fly.